where you're from and any messages you might want to say. Thank you. We'll start very, very soon. I just want to say we're going to start the program now. Good afternoon. My name is Judy Margles. I'm the director at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. I want to welcome you to today's program with Deborah Stueber. She's the daughter of Edith and Kurt Leuchter. I'm very grateful that Edith and Kurt are also with us today and will be available for the question and answer. I also want to thank Amber Curson, our digital coordinator, for her tech support of the program. At the museum, our mission is to explore the legacy of the Jewish experience in Oregon, teach the universal lessons of the Holocaust, and provide opportunities for intercultural conversations. We challenge our visitors to resist indifference and discrimination and to envision a just and inclusive world. And while we're able to offer this event and most other virtual events without charge, we're always grateful for any donation you might be able to make to support our work. March and April are especially busy months for programming. April is Genocide Awareness Month. You're going to find information about numerous programs, exhibitions, membership opportunities, or donating on our website. With the news from Ukraine absorbing so much of our attention these days, today's program is quite timely. The news, as we all know, is full of utterly appalling stories of Ukrainian children separated from their parents, fleeing for their lives, and facing very uncertain futures. During the Holocaust, less than 11% of Europe's pre-war Jewish population of children survived. And among the small number of these children still alive at the end of the Holocaust, thousands had survived because they were hidden. The stories we're hearing about Ukrainian children in hiding strike an eerily familiar chord. We're so fortunate today to be with Debbie Leuchter-Stueber and her parents, Edith and Kurt. They're going to share their story of survival with us today. Edith was born in Bruchsal, Germany. Kurt was born in Vienna, Austria. Both were hidden children in France during the war. Debbie was born and raised on Long Island. She attended the State University of Oneonta, New York. Shortly after she moved to Pittsburgh in 1991, she met the director of the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh, where she's been a volunteer for the past 2 decades. This past year, she was chosen as their Volunteer of the Year. Telling her parents' Holocaust experience to schools, universities, and various organizations for the last several years has been her passion. We're going to have time today for Debbie's presentation and then for your questions. So please use the Q&A tab. I think we're all familiar by now, but it is in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. I will endeavor to ask as many questions as possible. So please join me in welcoming Debbie. Thank you so much, Debbie, for being with us today.
Thank you very much. I just want to make sure that you can see my screen before I start. Judy, can you let me know that you see the first slide? Wonderful. Yes. Thank you so much. It's my honor and privilege today to tell you my parents' story. Thank you to Judy Margulies and the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education for hosting this event, and special thanks to the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh and my family, who continue to support me in my quest to share my parents' story. I'm very blessed that my parents, who are both Holocaust survivors, are alive and well at 93 and 94. In November of 2018, shortly after the Tree of Life massacre here in Pittsburgh, my sister spoke at a vigil in Brooklyn, New York. And in part of her speech, she mentioned that when she and I were girls, my father would always say, you know, the Holocaust could happen again, and you better have your passports ready to go to Israel. My sister would respond, Dad, this is the United States. That would never happen here. As time goes by, the voices and the eyewitnesses of the Holocaust are quickly dwindling at an extremely high rate due to the pandemic. The Anti-Defamation League, a leading anti-hate organization in the United States, determined that in 2019 and 2020, there were more than 2,000 anti-Semitic incidents and that is only the number that was reported. As we all know, anti-Semitism is ever prevalent in our society, and telling our family stories is of the utmost importance. It's now my generation's responsibility and the next to carry their torch. My mom, Edith Leuchter, was born in Bruchsal, Germany on December 31st, 1927. Her father owned Max Loeb grocery store, named after him, and he sold canned goods and produce, butcher supplies, and tools. The family lived above the grocery store. In July of 1938, Max made the difficult decision to emigrate to the United States, as he could tell that the future for him and his family was bleak. The plan was to send for everybody else, but unfortunately, that never happened. When my grandfather Max arrived in New York, he sent this telegram to his wife Julia and his children, Edith and Heinz. Pictured here is that telegram with the swastika emblem on the envelope. Pictured here is my mother's family. Julia Loeb, my grandmother, Edith's mother, and Julia and her husband on their wedding day, and Edith and her brother Heinz. On Kristallnacht, Edith was awakened in the wee hours of the morning. She could hear sirens and breaking glass and could even see flames outside of her window, at which point she crawled into bed with her mother Julia to seek comfort. Julia said it was no longer safe to stay, so they moved to Matilda Weil's house, Edith's grandmother, about 10 minutes away. Soon after, Heinz, Edith's brother, was sent to a school in Frankfurt. The letter pictured here is from Heinz to his father Max in the United States, and a drawing we believe Heinz made of himself and his sister Edith. Edith is bitter to this day about the fact that Heinz was sent away because she feels that if he wasn't, things could have turned out differently and he may have survived. From that school, Heinz was moved to an orphanage in Frankfurt and eventually deported to Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia. A letter from Heinz to his aunt and uncle is pictured here. In May 1944, he was deported to Auschwitz, and he was placed in a specific area called the Theresian family camp. 17,517 people were deported from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz. As the Allies were beginning to learn about the Holocaust, this camp was created within Auschwitz to mislead the world about the final solution. Heinz was on a transport of 2,499 people. Upon arrival in Auschwitz, he was given a prisoner number between A1445 and A2506. Of the 17,517 people who were deported from Theresienstadt, only 261 survived. Heinz was not one of them. He either died of starvation or disease or was killed in the gas chambers. On October 22nd, 1940, at least 6,500 Jews were deported from Bruchsal and surrounding areas in southwestern Germany. Edith, her mother Julia, and her grandmother Matilda were given 1 hour to gather a few possessions and walk to the railroad station. In the town, along with the other Jews and numbering about 120 people. The footage I'm about to show you was discovered only a few years ago in the Bruchsal, Germany archives. In February 2020, we discovered that my mother and her grandmother are in the footage. In this frame on the far right is my mom with the beret, and her mother is to the left of her, carrying a purse and a blanket. The local theater in my mother's hometown has produced a play entitled The Girl with the Hat Box, based on my mother's story. It will be premiering in Bruchsal, Germany this October, and my family will be there to see it. When they arrived at the railroad station, Julia asked for permission to call her son Heinz in Frankfurt to see if he could join them. At this point, I am going to share the footage. At least I hope so. Actually, Amber, can you try to share the footage for me?
Yeah, 1 second.
Thank you.
Nazi.
Thank you, Amber. As I said, Julia asked for permission to call her son Heinz in Frankfurt to see if he could join them. The police denied this request, but she was given approval to go home to look for the papers that she said she had to emigrate to the United States. She went back twice, but for whatever reason, the papers were not there. From inside the railroad station, they could see outside the windows. Townspeople, including children, were yelling that they were happy to see the Jews leave Bruchsal and were spitting at them. Eventually, they boarded the train and they breathed a small sigh of relief as they crossed the Rhine River, so they realized they were traveling south as opposed to east toward Poland. A few days later, they arrived in Gurs, an internment camp in southwestern France. Edith had to use straw to make mattresses, and there were too few blankets for too many people. Edith described that it was extremely disgusting and very muddy. She attended school but learned very little. In April 1941, Edith, her mother, and her grandmother were deported to another camp called Rivesaltes in the area of Perpignan, still in the south of France. By this point, Julia had a hernia and was ill. At this camp, the barracks were infested with insects, and according to my mom, the beds looked like cages for rabbits. Edith was always hungry. She says the food consisted of watery soup with vegetables that looked like weeds. One bright spot was that Max, Edith's father, was able to send packages and money from the United States. Her mother had to cut Edith's hair off at one point because of the proliferation of lice in the camp. The Vichy government of France gave the difficult choice to the parents in the camp to sign their children over to an organization called OSE, Organisation pour Sauver des Enfants, which translates to Children's Aid Society. This was a Jewish underground organization that operated throughout the war and saved over 5,000 Jewish children. Edith had to say goodbye to her mother, Julia, and her grandmother, Matilda, but she couldn't hug her grandmother because she had body lice at this point. A few months later, she received a telegram from her mother that she was deported to Drancy, another internment camp in Paris, and eventually deported to Auschwitz. We hope that Julia didn't make it there and died of the hernia in the cattle car on the long trip there. By the end of the war, Edith was in 5 schools and orphanages. While she was in one school, she was also a part-time nanny for a family from the area of Alsace-Lorraine, the geographic area between France and Germany. Edith was given the false French name Edith Labbé and papers that indicated that she was from that area as well, which made sense because she was from Germany and was already learning French. At one point, Edith was placed by the OSE, OSE, in an orphanage called Magelier for about 1.5 years. She made a lot of friends there, and she also met a boy named Kurt, and he really liked her, but she thought he was a big shot and didn't pay much attention to him. Toward the end of the war, she became a French Girl Scout, and here she is pictured with several of her friends, one of whom she remained best friends until recently when she had passed away. Upon liberation, she was able to get an affidavit from her father, Max, and emigrated to the United States. She reached the port of New York on a freighter called the Fort Royal on April 23rd, 1946. This is an ad that my grandfather Max placed in a German Jewish newspaper post-war called the Aufbau, searching for his wife and son, my uncle and my grandmother, who, as I said earlier, were murdered in Auschwitz. I have this map here just to show you how far apart Vienna is from Bruchsal. I believe it's between 6 and 8 hours. My father, Kurt Leuchter, was born in Vienna, Austria on February 6th, 1929. His father, Moritz, owned a wholesale silk business. My father was an only child, and he and his parents went on vacations, and life had a pretty good life until March 12, 1938, when everything changed. This is the day when Germany annexed Austria, otherwise known as the Anschluss, and all the borders were closed. On Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, Kurt was sent home early from school at 9:30 in the morning. On his way home from school, he saw a synagogue burning, and the SS were shooting and dragging the men out of the synagogue, forcing them to throw the Torahs into the Danube River. He hurried home. When he arrived home, the SS were arresting his father and 9 other Jewish men. Kurt sat on the steps and waited for his mother, Rosa, to return home from her typical shopping trip. She knew it was too dangerous to stay, so they walked 3 blocks to Kurt's grandmother's house. On their way, 2 SS approached them. One grabbed Kurt and the other grabbed Rosa by the hair and threw them down onto the street. A woman passerby tried to help them, but the SS threatened her with being sent to Dachau concentration camp. When they got to Kurt's grandmother's house, Kurt's cousin Heinz, no relation to my mother's brother, and his aunt Paula were there as well. 10 days later, there was a knock at the door, and to their surprise, it was Moritz. He had been held in an armory, and the SS treated him badly and threatened to cut off his finger if he couldn't take off his wedding ring, which fortunately he was finally able to do. Moritz was told by the Nazis that he had 3 months to get his family out of Austria. Moritz was able to procure a visa via Genoa, Italy, and in February 1939, they arrived in Antwerp, Belgium. They had with them a few suitcases and a bit of jewelry that they had hidden in their clothing. Here, Kurt learned how to speak Flemish and French, and everything was quiet for a while. In Antwerp, Kurt learned how to, he learned French in school Soon after arriving in Antwerp, my father was issued this passport, which has the swastika stamped on it, as well as the name Israel to assign, My father was issued this passport, which has the swastika stamped on it, as well as the name Israel above his own. The Nazis assigned the name Israel to all Jewish boys and Sarah to all Jewish girls, one of the many ways they ripped away people's identity. In Antwerp, they ended up living very near a man who happened to be from the town of Brody, Poland, which also happened to be Moritz, Kurt's father's hometown, as he moved to Vienna from Poland when he was a little boy. One night, when Kurt was eavesdropping on his parents' conversation, he heard that the neighbor would let them hide a bit of jewelry in a washcloth in his basement wall. On May 10th, 1940, the Germans invaded Belgium. Moritz, along with all the other Jewish men, were deported by the Belgians to the south of France. In July 1940, Rosa and Kurt were moved to a detention camp in Limburg, Belgium. My father's Aunt Paula, who looked Aryan as she had blonde hair and blue eyes, approached the Gestapo to procure papers for them to move to Paris and was granted permission. They didn't stay long, though, as they wanted to be near Moritz, so they hired a guy to take them across the demarcation line. The sign pictured here is part of the permanent exhibit at the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh, where I live. And the translation reads, "Jews are forbidden to cross the line of demarcation to go to the occupied zone of France. Jews are those who belong to the Jewish religion or have more than 2 Jewish ancestors in their grandparents' generation. An individual's grandparents will be considered Jewish if they belong to the Jewish religion. Any violation of the present decree will be punishable by imprisonment or a fine and by the possible confiscation of property." They crossed at night with 14 other Jews. The SS were guarding the border with guard dogs and machine guns. Luckily, they crossed without incident, and at this point, they boarded a train for Marseille in the south of France. Kurt and Rosa were supposed to go to Marseille, but accidentally got off the train 1 stop before, which was extremely dangerous because they had no ID papers. Somehow, at 11 years old, Kurt had the wherewithal to push his mother through the train station. They registered with the Jewish agency and were put in a detention camp called Hotel Terminus. By this time, Moritz was in 3 different camps. Saint-Cyprien, Gers, which I mentioned earlier in my mother's story, but they were in different sections and never crossed paths. And lastly, Camp des Milles. This camp was about 30 miles from where he and his mother were. My father was able to bring food to his father on the weekends. Soon after, Rosa and Kurt were moved to this camp as well. All 3 were able to get a pass to go to the city of Marseille, and my father had his bar mitzvah there at a synagogue. Soon after, Kurt's parents were given that same difficult choice to turn their son over to OSE, and on August 9th, 1942, they signed the papers. This is the last letter that Rosa and Moritz, my grandparents, wrote to Kurt, which he still has in his possession. Loosely translated, they plead with him to procure food for them and that he should take care of everything and to please make them proud. Months later, Kurt found out that Rosa and Moritz were both killed in the gas chambers in Auschwitz. Kurt was then placed in Hotel Bompard, which was repurposed as a detention camp. The conditions were terrible. So he and some friends decided to escape one night when the French police were drunk. They were caught and brought back there. The second time they escaped, they were more careful and went undetected. Somehow they knew that there was a home sponsored by OSE called Montpellier. There, my father was able to procure food from nearby farmers using a bicycle with a wagon. Here's where he met a young girl named Edith, who he liked, but as I mentioned before, the feeling wasn't reciprocated. Kurt and his friends were told they could go to the port of Marseille and board a ship for the United States. But at that point, the US had reached Africa and the German U-boats were bombing the armed forces. So he was sent back to the orphanage for a brief period of time. In February 1943, Kurt was moved to a boys' delinquent home in a town called Gelée-Bois. The director of the home, Mademoiselle Burel, knew he was Jewish, and she had a connection to the mayor of that town, and he was able to provide false papers to Kurt. His new name was now Claude Lambert. He, like my mother, was supposed to be from Alsace-Lorraine because he was from Austria, so he spoke German, and since he was in France, he was learning to speak French. In the orphanage, he cooked and chopped wood and performed various other chores. Months later, somebody squealed that there was a Jewish boy hiding in the home. So the Nazis came looking for him. He was hiding in a closet for several hours, and luckily the Nazis didn't open it. The director knew Kurt could no longer stay there, and she made a connection for him to the Maquis, the French underground. And for the next year, Kurt lived in the woods and helped blow up the last truck of German convoys and the rails that passed. They received French, British, and American assistance. Upon liberation, he was sent to 2 more orphanages in France, one in Lyon and one in Paris. At one point, he went back to the neighbor in Antwerp, Belgium. Sure enough, the jewelry was still on the washcloth in the basement wall. He brought his father's gold pocket watch and his mother's bracelet and wedding ring to America. In Paris, he got a job making leather handbags and in the evening attended an Ort technical school. In August 1946, he boarded the French troop ship, the Athos II, and along with about 70 other orphans who he took care of on the journey, he arrived in the port of New York on September 8th, 1946. In January 1947, my father was standing outside the Museum of Modern Art on the sidewalk, talking to his friends when who should tap him on the shoulder but Edith, the girl he liked in Montpellier, the orphanage in France. They embraced, and Edith must have seen something different in Kurt this time because they fell in love. And on August 13th, 1950, they were married, which coincidentally is also one of my son's birthdays. In January 1952, my father was drafted into the US Army and spent 9 months in Korea on the 38th parallel. Luckily, he made it home safe. Eventually, my dad became an aerospace engineer without a high school or college degree. My father worked on the guidance navigation system of a couple of different Apollo missions, and his name, along with several other 100 engineers, is still on microfiche on the moon. Pictured here is Kurt Leuchter's signature, and our family has several copies of it hanging in our homes. It's the signature that's diagonal in the center. In 2011, my father was awarded the Legion of Honor Medal given to World War II veterans by the French government. When I read the letter that accompanied it, something just didn't make sense to me. I knew my father was a Holocaust survivor, a Korean War vet, and that his name was on the moon, but then realized for the first time that since he fought in the French resistance, he's a World War II vet as well. In 2017, my family was fortunate enough to travel to my mother's hometown, Bruchsal, Germany, and we had 5 Stolpersteins installed. Stolperstein means stumbling stone. The project was created by a non-Jewish German. There are now about 75,000 Stolpersteins in 24 countries, and it's considered the largest constructed Holocaust memorial in the world. Pictured here are 5 that we had installed for Julia and Max Loeb, my maternal grandparents, for Heinz and Edith Loeb, my mother and uncle, and my maternal great-grandmother, Mathilde Weil. Mathilde Weil's prayer book, pictured here, from the 1880s, somehow survived, and we were able to use this prayer book to recite the Kaddish, the Jewish morning prayer, during the ceremony. The townspeople of Bruchsal were absolutely wonderful in that they welcomed us with open arms and were extremely generous of heart. Several spent the day of the ceremony with my family. There was even an assembly at the local middle school with presentations by students. We are very much excited to return to Bruchsal in October and connect with these good people. I grew up on Long Island, New York, in a loving but complicated home. My parents were extremely overprotective, understandably so. My first experience with anti-Semitism was in first grade when my classmate called me a dirty Jew. In middle school, a boy set firecrackers in the stairwell as I left school. When I was 16 and home alone, the mailbox affixed to our house was blown up and eggs were thrown at it on an occasional basis. At my current job many years ago, my former boss, who sat not too far away from me, was on the phone one day and I overheard him saying to a customer, "Well, why don't you Jew him down?" And more recently, I went to a local sandwich shop in my neighborhood and asked if they had black and white cookies, a cookie typically served in New York, and mentioned to the young woman behind the counter that I've had them in my synagogue. And she said, "You don't look Jewish." In 2019, the brother of my classmate who called me a dirty Jew in first grade made a post on my high school's Facebook group page. I decided to add a comment mentioning what his sister had said to me back then, and he contacted his sister, and she wrote me this email. My adult self is not shocked to see this given what was said and taught in my home, but I am no less ashamed, horrified, and saddened, especially when I see how this has stuck with you and hurt you so badly. If it's any comfort, I am not the same person and do not advocate hate against anyone and don't tolerate it in my life. Maybe it's some comfort in knowing that I have not continued to hurt others like I hurt you. Thank you for being open to my message. It's great to hear that it had a positive effect. In some ways, it's truly changed my life, and I get to add it to the story as well. As I said, my parents are 93 and 94 and are on the Zoom call right now. And this August will celebrate their 72nd wedding anniversary. Pictured here are my 2 sons, my sister and her 2 daughters. Not pictured here is the newest member of our family, my parents' first great-grandchild, who was just born last September. My mother's last name is Loeb, which means strong man or lion, and my father's last name is Leuchter, which means candelabra. I'd like to think that the strength and many branches of my family that now exist give us all light and hope for the future. Thank you for listening.
Oh, Debbie, thank you so much. I mean, I think I can say with confidence that there's never a story like this that we listen to and we don't find something new to think about. The resilience, the fortitude, the courage, the bravery, the fear, everything that you talked about your parents' experiences is very moving. And as I said at the beginning, particularly today in light of the world we're facing. And Kurt and Edith, are you able to turn your video on so we can see you? You are the stars of this program. So if
Dad,
there
you go.
There you are. We are so delighted that you're here with us today. There is a little issue with with Kurt and Edith's camera, so you will, for those of you listening in, you're going to see them zooming in and out a little bit. We tried to solve it before the program began unsuccessfully. So I want to urge everyone to put their questions in the Q&A. I see some questions coming in, and I have a lot of my own, so we will get started. I think one question, perhaps for both of you, but Edith, I will start with you and then go to Kurt. Tell us a little bit about what life was like before the Shoah in your family. As your daughter said, and we know you grew up in Bruchsal, were you raised in a Jewish home? Was your family Orthodox? Did you tell us a little bit about what stood out for you? Were you discriminated against as a child before Hitler invaded? Yeah.
No.
Before Hitler came to power.
Well, no. We were very friendly with all the friends and neighbors that we had.
Mm-hmm.
It was very good living in Bruchsal, and we went to school there. I went to school there and had a lot of non-Jewish friends.
And what about in terms of religion, Mom?
Oh, I went to Hebrew school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you celebrated Shabbat and all the holidays?
Oh, yes, we did. Yes. All the holidays and Shabbat, yes.
And Kurt, how about you in Vienna? Oh, sorry, Edith.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
In Vienna, what kind of home were you raised in?
They had the family. My whole family got killed, but we used to have a pretty good life because we used to go to my grandmother's house every Friday night and be together. My cousins and everybody was together on Friday night. And when it started, when the whole thing started, things were very bad. And we all had to leave in different direction. And that's how it was. We went to Belgium. My other relatives got taken to Lodz, which is called the German Litzmannstadt, which is also a very bad place with a concentration camp. From there, they got to Auschwitz. But my mother and I, for a while, we were lucky. We were in Belgium. My father was in concentration camp in France, as you heard.
Mm-hmm.
And until July of 1942, it wasn't too bad. I mean, you could live, especially in France, southern France, which was a little bit better than under the Nazis. The only thing was that when the deportations came, everything got torn apart. All their lives got torn apart.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can I ask?
I was bar mitzvah for 13 years
Dad.
old, and at 13 and a half, I was taken away from my parents And we had it was a big story because when they took us out of the camp, we didn't know where we were going.
Yeah, Dad, let's, that was actually, a lot of that was in my presentation. I would love for you to answer questions that weren't answered in my presentation. Thanks, Dad.
And you did mention thank you. You did mention your bar mitzvah. If I remember, you were bar mitzvahed in Marseille. Was that, am I correct about
Marseille,
that?
right?
In Marseille.
Yes.
And I mean, I was amazed to know that you had a bar mitzvah. Do you recall? So obviously it was very important that you had a bar mitzvah in the, in the midst of all this turmoil. How did you prepare for it? Who tutored you?
Yeah, somebody tutored me.
And do you remember who it was, or was?
And didn't you tell me there was a rabbi during this? There was also a rabbi.
My father did a lot too in camp.
Okay.
I was with him in camp for a while. He taught me a lot.
And Dad,
there were only 4 people at my bar mitzvah, my parents and 2 other people.
Yeah.
That was my whole bar mitzvah.
Yeah.
There was a rabbi there too, right, Dad?
Yes, it was the synagogue in Marseille. I remember still very well.
Do we know if I never asked you this question, Dad. Do we know if the synagogue is still there?
I have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to have to look into that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be really interesting.
I don't remember even the street where it was. I know it was up towards, because there's a big hill. I remember that, but I don't remember anymore exactly where it was.
And can we talk a little bit about both of your experiences in the orphanage? So were you how many other Jewish children were hiding there?
No,
When
I was the only one.
You were
No.
There were no other-
In the boys' delinquent
No, I'm
home.
talking about that was in hiding. Yeah, that was in hiding.
No, she's asking about this. No,
You asked me when I was in hiding, right?
no.
well in the orphanage in the OSE.
Majolier.
In Majolier, Dad.
Oh, Majolier, where I met Edith, you mean? Oh, there
Yeah.
were a lot of
There are a
kids.
lot of, yeah.
Yes, there were a lot of boys my age. And we used to help out and work there. We worked in the gardens and in the, when we had to cut wood, so and other things, we all worked there.
And they were Jewish. You're saying the other boys were Jewish.
Yes.
Yes, they
And
all
did
worked there.
were you told to say you weren't Jewish if someone asked you? Like, how did you navigate your Jewishness with the other children or with the staff there in the home?
At this time, things were still all right. They didn't take us yet. So we were all right. We were mostly Jewish kids there
In Majolier.
because they all came from camps, taken out of the different camps in
Got
France.
it.
So that's how it was. Only when I got in hiding, that's when I was the only one.
In the boys' delinquent home.
Non-Jewish person. She was a lady of 57 years old, very nice lady.
Mm.
She had a little bit bent
That's
forward,
enough.
and she was excellent. She knew I was Jewish. She was the only one. But somehow, I don't know how the word got out when they came looking, the Gestapo came looking for me when she hid in the
That's when you
basement.
had to leave.
Yeah,
That's when you joined.
Thank God she made contact with
right.
the underground.
Yeah.
I got into the underground for a whole year till Paris was liberated.
And how old were you when you joined the underground?
I said I was 16, but I was 15.
16. Wow.
15 and a half.
So
Yeah.
did you lie because you were supposed to be 16 in order to join the
He was
underground?
He was supposed to be 16.
Okay.
So I told him, no, I'm 16.
And Edith, your experiences being hidden, did anything stand out? Were you the only Jewish child you knew, or did you know of others at the time?
I knew of other kids, yes, and we were together in some, I was in a school, I forgot the name of the school, and I also was in some Catholic place,
Boarding schools.
boarding, yeah.
And were you well treated? Were you ever threatened with exposure?
No,
if
no,
you
I
missed-
was not. No,
So you were well treated.
yes, yes, I was.
And contact with your family during this time?
No, well,
None.
I wrote letters to my father, and he wrote letters to me, and I did get the letters, but this was a little bit late. It was almost before I came to the United States. But my father sent me packages of food. That was
Did-
1945.
So the rest of the time you didn't get packages and letters, you only got them starting in 45, Mom?
Yes, yes. I
Okay,
did.
so you had no communication with your dad
No,
before that?
Number
Okay.
of
No.
years.
no.
Wow. And Debbie, I'm going to ask you a question if I can. And please, for everyone listening in, do put your questions in the Q&A. So Debbie, in Portland, and I know some of the members of our Holocaust Speakers Bureau are listening in today. So a very special welcome to all of you. I'm sure they're all wishing, like I'm wishing, that you were in Portland and could join our Speakers Bureau and speak for us. But what is it like emotionally for you to give these presentations? If I wasn't mistaken, I thought you choked up a little bit when you were talking, and these are not easy things to be talking about when you're talking about people you love deeply and went through these experiences. So tell us about your experience in presenting and what your goals are for everyone listening in today.
Sure. So I've been telling, for about 10 or 12 years, I had been telling just my father's story, and I would just read it. And the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh invited me to speak in January of 2020 before the pandemic. And at that point, I said, it's time to tell both of their stories. So I started doing a bit more of a deep dive into my mother's story. And now I tell both of their stories.
Mm-hmm.
As a child of survivors, I can tell you that when I was little, I do remember locking myself into the bathroom because it was the only room in the house that could be locked, and cried and asked God why I had no grandparents, although I did have my one grandfather till I was 7.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most difficult things for me as a child of survivors is that I'll never understand what happened, even though I hear the stories. I will say that it's probably common among children of survivors that we can get a little bit obsessed, and I spend a little bit too much time listening to stories and watching things, but I feel an obligation to do that. And I definitely know there's some intergenerational trauma in terms of a little bit of neuroses or getting excited over little things. And I think that is part of it.
Sure.
And in terms of the future, I will speak to anyone and everybody who will listen to me. But I will say that I speak often to Jewish organizations and synagogues. And what I'm really trying to do is to reach non-Jews.
Sure.
Because most Jews have at least a little bit of an education about the Holocaust, or maybe a lot more. And as we know, I think I'm going to get this right, Judy, please correct me. At this point, there's 20 states that have Holocaust education as mandatory.
I think it's 12.
Okay. I do know that Pennsylvania, where I live, is not mandatory. It's highly encouraged. To think that in this day and age that Holocaust education is not mandatory in every single state blows my mind. But then again, we do have states who want to ban mouse. So the book. So my goal is to reach out to as many people as I possibly can.
And we are grateful. And I really appreciate your honesty in answering that question, because I think it is certainly important for all of us to understand what it takes to actually have this kind of discussion. So thank you. Kurt, coming back to you for a second, speaking of difficult things, I was really struck to know that you were drafted and went to Korea. So what was the experience like when you got your draft notice? Were you a willing draftee? Did you think, wait a minute, I've been through so much, why? And how did you feel by that time? You'd been in the United States for 5 or 6 years, if my math is correct. So fighting a war for the United States, how did that make you feel too?
Well, I tell you what, I came to the United States to be free. And I think it was my goal to join the American Army.
Ah, okay.
Because I had to pay back something. So I went, they asked us, if anybody have any objection, I would never say no there to a country that take me in. But thank God I came back. It was horrible. Let me tell you that. But what can I tell you?
Yeah.
And I had some experience from the resistance, and that's why which was not because I wanted, because I had to. So what can I tell you? It's enough already. That's what I gotta say. Now we see what's coming here. It's who knows what's gonna happen. It's terrible.
Dad, I have a question for you about the resistance that I never asked you before. About how many, I'm assuming it was just men or boys. How many were in your group that traveled throughout the woods?
Oh, we were spread up. We were spread up like maybe 25, split up all over because we don't get caught all together. So we had to get split up.
Okay, thanks.
Kurt, I do have another question for you, and you will love this. Someone actually, a member of our Holocaust Speakers Bureau, posted in the chat that your legacy has gone to the moon, literally and figuratively. I think that is so beautiful. So thank you, Clarice, for posting that.
Yes, it was a very interesting job.
And again, my ears really perked up when I found out that you were an aerospace engineer, because of course, Operation Paperclip, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and I don't know whether you were working in Huntsville, Alabama, but certainly the many of the scientists and engineers associated with the American moon expeditions were Nazis. So were you aware of that when you were first working?
I worked for a big company, Grumman Aerospace, which is now Northrop Grumman. And there were no Nazis in that company. I can tell you that.
I never knew that.
They were all very good friends and engineers who worked together.
So you were aware at the time of that many of them were affiliated with the Nazi Party?
But if what? I didn't understand.
No,
Were you aware that some of the engineers you were?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes.
So that was
Definitely.
known. Okay.
Definitely. Yes.
And how did that affect?
Werner von Braun was the head of it.
Yeah. Oh, so he was the head of.
He was not a Nazi. He was against. He was
against. He was a.
And at the time, you might not have known about Werner. Did you know at the time Werner von Braun was a Nazi?
Yes.
Oh, you did.
Oh, yeah.
But no, then he changed. No,
yes. We thought first that he was on the Russian side, but then we found out he came.
No, it came out later, right?
Yes.
So did that affect your work? Did it?
No, not really.
Not really.
We didn't think about that because I don't think we did something for the United States, and that was matter to me. That we did something good for the U.S.
Okay. All right.
That was my idea. And I was very happy. I worked 23 years for the company. and 20 years of my life.
And can we go back to the footage that you showed, Debbie? So
Yes.
who was in the footage?
Okay, so my mother on the right side was the girl with the beret, and mom was 12, almost 13, because it was October 22nd, 1940.
Right.
To the left of my mom was her mother. And it's very possible that her grandmother's in the footage too, but my mother could not confirm that, so we don't ever say that. I can tell you that when we first showed my mother the footage, which was a difficult decision to make, but she wanted to see it, she even recognized the rabbi of the town, who had already been identified by the people in Bruchsal, because when the footage was discovered, it was also pieced together by a really wonderful gentleman and some other people in Bruchsal. And they went frame by frame identifying these people, and then asked us to confirm that it was my mom and her mother. And the fact that I never met my grandmother, but I got to see her walking, and that was really powerful.
So Edith, when you first saw that film, and where did you find it? How did you come across it?
So
there are many people listening in, I'm sure, who are doing family histories. So.
Yeah. Okay. So in 2017, we had the Stolpersteins installed.
Right.
And the people in the town, non-Jews, who were these incredible human beings. This one particular man, Rolf Schmidt, somehow was given the information that this footage was in the archives, and that's how it came to be. And then only a couple of years later did we discover that my mother and her mother are in it. And there's actually a website that talks about the day of deportation. I can actually drop it in the chat.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
And Edith, what was it like for you to see that footage?
It was very heart-wrenching, but I wanted to see it.
Yeah, of course. So there is a question that I'll ask from the audience, which is an excellent question. That how did you manage throughout your experiences to maintain a sense of hope and optimism? Like, where did this resilience, this fortitude, and I know Debbie's going to share the chat with you after the program, but you'll see a lot of people are really pulling this thread about your experiences. Were there people who were helping you to stay alive and keep your hope alive? Yeah,
sure. In France, they were non-Jewish people. They were very nice, and they hid us. We were hiding with the French people, and they were not Nazis, and they were not collaborators.
Are you in contact with anyone or descendants of anyone who helped you survive during that time?
No.
Yeah.
In Bruchsal? Well,
Yeah.
Kurt went to Bruchsal. I didn't go.
You weren't able to go,
I
right?
met all these people, and I didn't know them before. They were younger, so.
I met her girlfriend that she knew from school when I went there, and her husband. So
Yeah, her name is Maria.
We had a nice talk together.
What did Debbie say?
So Maria and her husband and their daughter and son-in-law attended the Stolperstein ceremony with us.
Yes.
And Maria is one of the characters in the play that is premiering in Germany in October.
She's not alive anymore. She passed away.
The daughter, right? Yeah.
And Debbie, you talked about going back to Bruchsal as a family. Did you go back to Vienna? Have you been to Vienna, and what was that?
We both went
We
back.
both went
Went
back.
back to
Mhm.
Vienna.
We were
So
a couple of times back.
Yeah,
Did you hope to put the Stoppelsteiners
But I
by
tell you,
your home?
Wait, she's asking.
no, they don't have any there. They didn't
They
have
don't
any-
have Stolperstein
any
in Vienna.
Stolperstein in
I think
there.
they do now. But
do you think they do now? Okay,
I've seen them there.
I'll have to, oh, okay, I'll have to
They
look
do
into
have
that
them,
then.
Like Judenplatz in the Jewish. on
Okay,
the
so
Jewish
not
street.
in front of people's homes, which is where they're supposed to be.
I have seen them in front of people's homes.
Oh,
yes.
okay.
I
I'll have
been.
to, I'll
I
have to
don't know
look
how
into
old
that.
they are, though.
Okay.
We are coming up to the hour, and I have my most important question, which we're going to ask, but and that's about MoMA. You met in front of MoMA. Have you been back? Is it a place that you hold in your life? You haven't been back.
No, we
Because-
haven't been back. Where we met at the museum. We didn't go back there.
You haven't been back. That's funny.
No.
Does the Museum of Modern Art know this?
Yes, no, right.
That's
No,
a great, oh,
Fifth
I'm
Avenue,
sorry.
yeah, Fifth Avenue, yeah.
No, we didn't go back.
didn't go
No,
back.
No.
Yeah.
So Judy, that's a great question. Just before the pandemic, when MoMA was approaching, I don't remember how many years, whatever the number of years of their anniversary, their granddaughter, my niece, works for the Harvard Museum, and she has friends who work for MoMA, and we made a connection, and they were supposed to use my parents' story in some of their marketing materials or some kind of promotion, and then COVID hit.
Oh,
So
okay.
it never happened.
Still to happen. That would be wonderful.
That would be.
Wonderful. Yeah. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. I know everybody listening in is agreeing with me. These stories, they do give us hope, actually. And Edith and Kurt, you are absolutely for the next generation. I hope that this program is being recorded. It will be available on our website. I think many more people will have an opportunity to listen to it, reflect, and really grow from your experiences. So thank you. And Debbie, thank you so much.
Thank you
It was a
both.
pleasure
Thank
meeting
you.
you, ma'am.
Really, someday you'll come to Portland. We'll get you there. Everyone else, thank you, thank you, thank
Thank
you.
you thank you so much.
It will all be posted. The recording will be posted on our website. So thank you very, very much for
Thank
joining
you
us
also.
today.
Thank you
Yes,
too.
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you
Yes,
so much.
Bye-bye.
appreciate it, yeah.
Bye.
Bye. Okay.